Think back to every World Cup you've ever watched. Think about the ones that went sideways for a team, the heavy defeat in the opening game, players arguing with the bench, that gnawing feeling that something is fundamentally broken before the tournament has found its rhythm. You've seen it before. We all have. But what unfolded at the 2026 World Cup this past week was something most of us have genuinely never witnessed. A head coach was dismissed during the group stage after just one match. Not at halftime, not after some slow-burning crisis that built over weeks. After one game, one afternoon, 90 minutes of football that ended a man's tenure at a World Cup before it had barely started. In the long history of this tournament, stretching back decades across dozens of host nations and hundreds of squads, this is confirmed to be the first time a national team coach has been dismissed during the group stage after a single match. That's not just a statistic. It's a statement about what modern international football has become, and about the very specific kind of pressure that Tunisia carried into this tournament in North America. The match was a 5-1 defeat to Sweden, and for a team that had fought hard to qualify for this stage, it wasn't just a loss, it was a humiliation that apparently left the Tunisian Football Federation with no choice at all. Let's take a step back and understand how we got here. Because the story of what happened in that stadium in Monterrey, Mexico, didn't begin last Sunday. It began months ago, with a chain of decisions, disappointments, and institutional instability that had already left Tunisian football fragile before a single ball was kicked in anger at the 2026 World Cup. Tunisia came into this tournament having already dismissed their previous manager just 5 months earlier. That coach, removed by what was described as mutual consent, lost his job following an early exit from the Africa Cup of Nations, knocked out in the round of 16 by Mali in a match that, frankly, should never have been that competitive. A team that many had considered potential contenders walked out to a side that played part of the match with 10 men in extra time. The cracks were already visible, the structure was already fragile, and the patience of the federation was already thin. Into that environment stepped Sabri Lamouchi, a French-born coach of Tunisian heritage, 54 years old, with a career that included stints at club level in England and France, and international experience at a previous World Cup with Ivory Coast. He was appointed in January of this year and handed a contract designed to run through 2028. The mandate was simple enough in theory: stabilize the squad, build toward the long term, and guide the Eagles of Carthage through the group stage of the 2026 World Cup. His preparation record, though, offered little reassurance. Before the tournament, Tunisia managed one win across 5 matches, a narrow 1-0 friendly against Haiti. That was surrounded by defeats to Austria, a goalless draw with Canada, and, most alarmingly, a 5-0 hammering by Belgium in their final warm-up fixture just days before the World Cup began. That result alone should have been a warning sign loud enough to be heard in Tunis. Belgium dominated from start to finish. Tunisia looked not just out of form, but organizationally confused. And yet, the federation pressed on, and so did Lamouchi. Then came Sunday the 14th of June, the Sweden game. Sweden arrived at this World Cup without the kind of fanfare that some of the bigger European sides generate. They qualified without particular drama, were placed in a group that many considered open, and entered the tournament ranked well outside the top tier of favorites. And yet, what they produced against Tunisia was a masterclass in efficiency and a clinical dissection of a team that had no answers from the very first minute. Yassine Ayari opened the scoring after just 6 minutes. Alexander Isak doubled the lead before halftime. Victor Gyökeres added a third. Matthias Svanberg made it 4. And Ayari struck again to complete the 5. Tunisia's only response was a single goal from Omar Rekik, a consolation so late in the proceedings that it changed nothing about the story being written in real time. Isak finished the afternoon with 1 goal and 2 assists, posting an 8.8 rating on match-tracking platforms, the kind of performance that underlines just how dominant Sweden truly were. Tunisia, by contrast, were passive, disorganized, and visibly uncertain of their own shape and intent. But the scoreline, as damaging as it was, wasn't the only story coming out of that stadium. What reportedly compounded the damage for the federation was the manner of Tunisia's performance. and something that played out in full view of the cameras when a substituted player visibly clashed with the technical staff on the touchline. That kind of image, broadcast globally on the opening weekend of a World Cup, is the sort of thing that football federations cannot ignore. It tells a story. It suggests a dressing room that isn't unified. It signals a group of players that may not fully believe in what the manager is asking of them, or in each other. And in the context of everything that had already happened, the 5-0 loss to Belgium, the unconvincing preparation, the questions about squad selection, that image became the final data point in a very short equation. Lamouchi had also drawn criticism within Tunisia for his selection choices ahead of the tournament. Several experienced players, who between them had accumulated well over 200 international appearances, were left out of the squad. The logic of prioritizing fresh energy and new ideas is understandable in the abstract. But at a World Cup, experience isn't merely a nice quality to have. It is often the single thing that holds a team together when the pressure becomes overwhelming, when the game is slipping away, when the crowd noise is deafening, when the opponent is 2 goals up and the bench is starting to look at the clock. Experience provides a kind of institutional memory, a way of saying, we have been here before, and here is what we do. Without that, young squads can drift. And against Sweden, Tunisia drifted badly. The Tunisian Football Federation's response was swift and unprecedented. Within hours of the final whistle on Sunday, reports were circulating in Tunisia that Lamouchi's position was untenable. By Monday morning, the dismissal was confirmed. A brief official statement appeared on the Federation's Instagram account. An agreement had been formally reached to relieve coach Sabri Lamouchi of his duties. There was initially talk of appointing Monder Kebayer on an interim basis to manage the crisis. But within 24 hours, the Federation had reversed that plan entirely and turned to a name that, in the world of African football, carries an extraordinary specific weight: Hervé Renard. If you've followed international football across the past 15 years with any seriousness, that name needs no introduction. Renard is one of the most genuinely distinctive figures in modern football management. A Frenchman, 57 years old, calm in his demeanor, almost always photographed in that signature open-collared white shirt. His record defies easy categorization and honestly challenges the conventional wisdom about what a football manager can realistically achieve. He won the Africa Cup of Nations with Zambia in 2012. That achievement alone would be enough to secure a legacy in almost any other career. Zambia were ranked as heavy outsiders by virtually every observer. But the victory carried something beyond tactics or squad quality. It was emotionally loaded in ways that few sporting events ever are. The final was played in Gabon, near the site where a plane carrying the Zambian national team had crashed into the Atlantic Ocean back in 1993, killing everyone on board: players, coaches, staff. The entire squad of that generation gone in an instant. Renard spoke to his players directly about what it would mean to win in that place, on behalf of those who never got the chance. And they did win, 8-7 on penalties in a final that anyone who witnessed it will never forget. 3 years later, he won the Africa Cup of Nations a second time, this time with Ivory Coast, a squad full of established names and decades of near misses. To win the tournament with 2 different nations is something no other coach in the competition's history has ever managed. That single statistic separates Renard from virtually every other manager in his profession. It tells you something about his ability to walk into different environments, understand different groups of people, and build something that works under the most intense pressure. His journey since those victories has taken him across more continents than most coaches ever visit. He managed Morocco at the 2018 World Cup, a campaign remembered primarily for a stunning opening performance before an ultimately disappointing exit. He then took charge of Saudi Arabia, and what happened in Qatar in 2022 remains one of the single greatest upsets in the history of this tournament. Saudi Arabia defeating Argentina, the eventual world champions, 2-1, in one of the defining matches of the modern era. At halftime, with Argentina 1 goal up, Renard delivered what has since become the stuff of football folklore, a team talk so energized, so precise in its delivery, that the Saudi players emerged for the second half transformed. They equalized, they took the lead, they held on, and the world stopped to watch. After his time leading Saudi Arabia, Renard took charge of the French women's national team before returning to Saudi Arabia's club and federation structure, a stint that ended just a couple of months ago. He has been available, and when Tunisia came calling, he said yes, immediately. He now takes charge of a team that has played one game, conceded 5 goals, scored 1, and must face Japan in their second group match on the 21st of June before squaring off against the Netherlands. In any realistic reading of the situation, Tunisia's path to the knockout stage is extremely narrow. The mathematics are brutal in a 48-team World Cup where, depending on the group structure, as few as 1 or 2 teams advance directly. A 4-goal deficit in terms of goal difference from the opening game leaves almost no margin for anything less than back-to-back victories combined with results elsewhere going perfectly in Tunisia's favor. That is a set of conditions that is far more likely to fail than succeed. But context matters here, and Renard has walked into apparent impossibilities before. The Japan match looms as the critical moment. Japan arrived at this tournament in strong form. In their opening group game, they drew 2-2 with the Netherlands, a result that speaks not to failure, but to genuine competitiveness against one of Europe's top-ranked sides. Japan are no longer the surprise package of World Cups past. They have developed over successive tournaments into a team that combines European club-level technical ability. Many of their key players are operating at the highest level in the Bundesliga and other top European leagues, with a collective discipline and tactical sophistication that makes them genuinely difficult to break down. For Tunisia's reconfigured squad, under a coach who has had 4 days to install a system and rebuild a psychological state, the challenge is severe. And yet, Renard held his first training session with the squad on Tuesday, just hours after his appointment was confirmed. By all accounts, the atmosphere in the camp shifted noticeably. This is something observers have noted consistently about Renard's arrivals at teams in crisis. There is a quality of presence he brings that changes the emotional temperature of a dressing room quickly. Whether that quality can survive contact with the reality of a World Cup knockout situation in 4 days is the question that June the 21st will begin to answer. There is a broader political dimension to this story that deserves attention, because what happened in Monterrey doesn't exist in a vacuum. The relationship between the Tunisian state and the Tunisian Football Federation has a turbulent history. In the lead-up to the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, FIFA itself was forced to send a formal warning letter to the federation after Tunisia's then Minister of Youth and Sports made public comments suggesting the government might dissolve the federation's governing structures. FIFA's letter was explicit. Any government interference in the independence of the federation would risk Tunisia's exclusion from the tournament. The federation survived that crisis, but the tension between political power and footballing governance in Tunisia has never truly been resolved. That background matters when you consider the speed of Lamouchi's dismissal. Within hours of a single defeat, however heavy, a national federation made an unprecedented decision in international football history. That kind of speed suggests institutional pressure operating above the purely sporting level. It suggests a federation acutely aware of public and political scrutiny. It suggests an environment where the tolerance for failure, particularly visible, televised, globally humiliating failure, is essentially zero. Whether that environment is healthy for football development, or whether it creates exactly the kind of short-term panic that prevents teams from building genuine long-term programs, is a debate that Tunisian football will need to have long after this tournament ends. The broader picture at this 2026 World Cup tells a more complicated story about African football as a whole. In the opening round of group play, the continent's 10 representatives, more than ever before thanks to the tournament's expansion from 32 to 48 teams, produced results that range from genuinely impressive to catastrophically disappointing. Morocco held Brazil to a 1-1 draw. Ivory Coast defeated Ecuador 1-0 in a result that stunned observers. Ghana beat Panama. Cape Verde frustrated Spain. Several African nations demonstrated in the first games that the continent's tactical sophistication and individual quality have reached a level that can trouble anyone on the planet. And then there was Tunisia. The contrast could not have been sharper. In a round where African football was being discussed as having arrived at a new level of maturity and competitive standing, Tunisia became the story for entirely the wrong reasons. a 5-1 loss, a coaching dismissal, institutional chaos broadcast live to a global audience. It reinforced a narrative that African football advocates have spent years trying to dismantle, that for all the talent the continent produces, the conditions under which its national teams operate, the federations, the preparation, the political interference, the short-termism, too often prevent those players from performing at their actual level. Sabri Lamouchi himself deserves a moment in this conversation beyond the headlines. Whatever the quality of the defeat against Sweden, and however justified the Federation's decision might have been in their own internal assessment, a man's coaching career has been publicly damaged in front of the largest sporting audience on earth. He came into the job in January. He inherited a team that was already in a state of transition following a difficult Africa Cup of Nations campaign. He faced unresolved issues in the dressing room that, given what we know about the conflict visible during the Sweden match, were clearly present before the tournament began. The 5-1 result was on his watch, but the conditions that produced it were not built in the space of 5 months. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of international football management. When things go wrong publicly and spectacularly, the manager is the most visible target. But the institutional decisions about squad building, about federation structure, about preparation time, about player management and dressing room dynamics, are rarely made by the manager alone. Lamouchi will coach again. His experience across several countries and competitions is not defined by one afternoon in Monterrey, but the human reality of what happened to him, and the speed of it, is worth sitting with for a moment beneath all the tactical analysis. So, where does all of this leave Tunisia as of today? They face Japan on June the 21st. Renard has confirmed he is motivated by the challenge, telling reporters that he is up for it, which, knowing his record, is not the kind of statement that should be dismissed lightly. The squad knows who he is. They know what he has won. The Saudi players in Qatar in 2022 knew what he was capable of, and they produced what remains one of the most talked about results in World Cup history. There is a version of this story where Renard walks through the door and something genuinely shifts, where the tactical reorganization, the motivational clarity, the simple authority of a man who has won the Africa Cup of Nations with 2 different countries changes the psychological state of a squad that was clearly struggling under its previous leadership. That version is not the most likely version. Tunisia are 4 goals behind in goal difference. Japan drew with the Netherlands, which means they have a point, and they need to protect it. The Netherlands, Tunisia's final group game opponent, arrived at this tournament among the pre-tournament favorites and have already demonstrated their quality. The mathematics remain brutal, but that is exactly what makes this World Cup worth watching. Not just the expected narratives, the established powers advancing, the predicted upsets materializing roughly on schedule, but the genuinely unexpected ones. The ones where a man in a white shirt steps onto a training pitch in Monterrey with 4 days to turn a catastrophe into something else entirely. Those are the stories that define tournaments. Those are the moments that football remembers. What this episode also reveals is something larger about the direction international football is heading. The expansion to 48 teams was sold partly as a democratizing force. More nations at the table, more stories to be told, more footballing cultures given a stage. And there is genuine truth in that argument. 10 African nations competing at a single World Cup is a historic reality. But expansion also concentrates pressure on individual group games in ways that can be destabilizing. When the margin for error in a tournament group is effectively 0, when a single result can mathematically eliminate a team from realistic contention, the structures that surround national teams are tested immediately and without grace. For some federations, that test reveals resilience. For others, it reveals exactly the kind of structural fragility that no amount of talent can compensate for on its own. Tunisia's first game at the 2026 World Cup may ultimately be remembered as a moment of institutional collapse. It may equally be remembered as the moment Hervé Renard walked back into the story that seems, somehow, to always find a place for him. The man who won in Gabon for the souls of a plane crash. The man who turned a Saudi halftime into football legend. The man who is now, improbably, sitting on the Tunisia bench in Monterrey, with 4 days, a wounded squad, and everything still to prove. Whether the mission is possible or not, we are going to find out very soon.